Hello everyone, my name is Abelnet, I go by NIGHTSLINK, and today I'm going to do a postmortem on NIGHTSLINK, my first commercial game as a solo dev. First, a little bit about me. I'm a game designer and developer. I'm also a PhD student at the doctoral program in digital media at the Faculty of Engineering of the University of Porto, and you can find me on Twitter at NoiseMinded. While I have always played games, I didn't always think that I could or even that I wanted to be a game developer. Initially, I wanted to be a musician, and while I was pursuing that, I fell in love with the technological side of music, and so I went and studied music production. It was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot of things that still come in handy nowadays, but I remember one day looking at my colleagues and realizing that they were more into it than I was. At that time, I was meeting a lot of people that were studying, developing games, and also had the opportunity to enroll in a digital games class, where my colleagues and I had to make a game in Unity. We ended up making a horror game about a man with paranoid schizophrenia that discovers a hidden passage leading to a bunker below his home. Upon entering it, he finds out someone has been living there all along. Just as an aside here, if you want to make a game about mental illness and you're not an expert on the matter, please don't. It's incredibly irresponsible, and in retrospect, I shouldn't have done it. That game was pretty bad, but I also learned a lot from it. And the fact that I had this newfound superpower of being able to make games, regardless of how bad they were at the time, it was an awesome thing for me. I wanted to become more independent and multidisciplinary, so that I could have the freedom to create the games I wanted, from start to finish. I learned how to code and 3D model, and from there I started going to game jams, and eventually started creating my own solo projects outside of jams. In 2020, I made a small game called Anomaly, and released it on itch.io. I think this was my first major experience with releasing a game to the public, and having YouTubers play it for thousands of people to watch, which was quite daunting at the time. But it was also the moment that I proved to myself that I could develop a game from start to finish by myself. From there, I started work on a new project, and earlier this year I released my first commercial game, NIGHTSLINK. But before we get into that, I want to talk a bit about how I arrived at the game's premise. Most of my game ideas start with a relatively simple concept. I then build around that concept, explore its ramifications, and give it my own twist. In Radiohead's music video, Just, we see a man suddenly collapse to the ground. As a crowd starts to form around him, he insists he hasn't fallen and that he is fine and just wants to be left alone. The crowd assumes he is just drunk or mad, but he insists that he isn't. Eventually, they desperately want to know why the man is lying on the floor. The man refuses to answer at first. "You don't want to know, please believe me." However, the crowd becomes more insistent, and the man eventually tells them the reason he is lying down. "Yes, I'll tell you. I'll tell you why I'm lying here. But God forgive me, and God help us all, because you don't know what you ask of me." We the viewers don't know what he says, but on the next shot, we see the entire crowd has joined him and is now lying down in a despondent state as well. Similarly, the works of H.P. Lovecraft are full of things that should not be named or known to man. Near the end of his books, the protagonist often receives some mind-blowing insight about the nature of the cosmos and our place in it, and is forever marked by this knowledge, sometimes even driven to insanity. There are forces at play that are bigger than we can even imagine, and they can't be reasoned with. Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk takes place during World War II, as Allied troops attempt to evacuate from the town of Dunkirk during a arduous battle with German forces. Throughout the movie's runtime, not a single German soldier is shown on screen until the very end. The movie is presented to us from the perspective of the trapped soldiers, and the fact that we are not able to even see the enemy helps to convey their sense of fear and desperation in facing death. It's as though they are being attacked from all directions, at random intervals, by an unseen threat that they cannot be prepared for. The unheard, the unthinkable, and the unseen. All of these things hold an undeniable and terrifying power over us. For quite some time, I've been interested in these kinds of themes. I wanted to create a silent, post-apocalyptic world in which people lived hidden behind locked doors. So, I built a picture of it in my head, and I made a short game that captured it through the perspective of a single person. I knew that if I wanted to make a short game that stuck with people, I had to give it some depth. This world lived in my head for more than a year, and when an idea sticks with you for so long, it starts to take shape and solidify. You develop an understanding of the internal rules of the world that then you can consistently apply when creating a representation of it. Your characters start having names and personalities way beyond what can or even should be conveyed in such a short game. It may at times feel like you're wasting your time thinking about things that will never come into play, but I do believe that this is the only way to create an immersive world that feels like it exists beyond what is shown, because it does. In NIGHTSLINK, you are a delivery person tasked with delivering cassette tapes to a rundown apartment building. However, it quickly becomes apparent that these are not regular tapes. Suffice it to say, they keep the residents asking for more. Today I wanted to share with you the design process behind it, as well as some lessons I've learned along the way. Some of these lessons will be particular to Unity, but hopefully you can apply them to other game engines as well. Let's start with the game's graphics. For this game, I really wanted to explore a sort of cinematic approach to a story-based horror game, and combine it with old-school PS1 style graphics. I am a big fan of PlayStation 1 style graphics for a number of different reasons. Number one being they are faster to produce. Given the limitations of the PS1 hardware, the graphics are faster to produce. Me being a solo developer, that's a big plus. Creating 3D models that look good, despite these limitations, requires skill, but nevertheless they take less time to be created. One thing that particularly fascinates me about PS1 graphics is how much they evolved over time, as developers adapted and found new ways to get the most out of the system. Tomb Raider came out in 1996, about 2 years after the console's launch. This was one of the first PS1 games I played as a kid. Contrast this against Vagrant Story, which is in my opinion one of the most visually impressive games to come out for the PS1. It came out in February 2000, the month before the PS2 launched in Japan. It used vertex colors beautifully to fake lighting for its environments. It had wonderfully animated characters that looked expressive and detailed, despite having half of the polygon count of those in Final Fantasy VIII, for example. Here's a clever trick they used to simulate lighting on their characters. They would create a second 3D model for each character, brighten them up, and slightly move them towards the direction of the light, which made it look as though they were being illuminated by a hard light from that direction. This huge contrast between two games released on the same console goes to show the ingenuity, technical expertise, and artistry of the developers of the PS1 era. It's also an opportunity to reimagine the visual aesthetics of the PS1 era applied to games with more modern gameplay and sensibilities. Take for example static cameras and tank controls that were often employed in PS1 games. They are old-fashioned, and nowadays we have other paradigms when it comes to moving a character through 3D space, which work better in my opinion. But more generally, game design has also evolved over time. This is an opportunity to apply the retro visual aesthetic to more modern games from a design standpoint. Constraints foster creativity. It's generally easier to find interesting ideas with a more limited palette of options. This, in my opinion, applies to any creative medium. Also, when looking for ways to get around the limitations that were imposed by the PS1's hardware, we sometimes find solutions and learn techniques applicable in other contexts. The nostalgia factor can help convey certain emotions to the player. This is probably the most obvious point, but it should be mentioned. Using graphics that refer to a specific era helps to transport the player into that era. That's useful when we want to instill in them the same emotions they felt when they were younger and possibly were having their first contact with video games. For this project, I wanted to use a specific scriptable render pipeline that replicates that PS1 style, from the vertex snapping to the texture warping. It's called the Haunted PS1 Render Pipeline, named after the community that created it. Unlike other solutions I've tried in the past, this pipeline does not allow me to cheat. If I wanted real-time shadows on something, I would have to do it the old-fashioned way, which, in case you're interested, involves having a duplicate of the mesh squashed down and rigged to copy the rotation and animation of the main rig. This is just an example of how developers learned to circumvent the limitations of the PS1 back in the day. Early on, I decided to use tile maps for the textures. I was inspired by the way it was done in the first Silent Hill game. Nowadays, these are called texture atlases, which are basically just images that contain multiple smaller images. They are used for optimization purposes, since objects that use the same texture atlas generate a single draw call. Because of the PS1's limitations, the meshes had to be subdivided like this, in order to avoid texture warping. Funnily enough, because the size of each of the subdivisions is generally the same, this meant that they could easily map the UV coordinates of each quad to a tile in the texture. Here you can see an example of how the camera perspective could sometimes warp the textures. Look at the object Spyro is facing, and how the lines go from straight to a zigzag pattern depending on the camera's perspective. Subdividing the mesh circumvents this issue. Since I wanted the environments to evolve over time, using a single tile map for most of the environment textures also proved quite convenient. This way, I only had to create 3 different textures, one for each phase of the game. If I could give you one advice regarding this part, is to pick a texel density and stick to it. If you don't know what texel density is, it's just a fancy term for how much detail a texture has in relation to its size in the game. It's good to keep this value as consistent as possible so that there aren't any noticeable differences in detail from object to object. In games with a retro art style and lower resolution textures, these differences are even more noticeable. For reference, the standard texel density for most third-person games is 5.12 pixels per centimeter. If an object is going to be closer to the camera, such as guns in an FPS, 10.24 pixels per centimeter is a good value. For NIGHTSLINK, I went with 32 pixels per meter for the modular pieces in the environment, and double of that for other props. And since we're talking about different values here, here's a couple more that you might find useful as a starting point if you're trying to get this PS1 aesthetic. The screen resolution I opted for is based on 640 by 480, which is the highest resolution the PlayStation was able to output. I then widened that resolution a bit horizontally, up to 853 480 to fit a more modern 16:9 aspect ratio. Now moving on to characters. Skin rigging was very rare at the time. Different PS1 games animated their characters differently, but Resident Evil 1 and 2's characters had limbs as separate meshes from the body, and animated that way. I decided to go the same route for this project. One thing I quickly realized is that when working with such low poly characters, it helps to triangulate the mesh early on and really take advantage of that added flexibility to add detail. This takes a while to get used to if you're used to working with quads, but it really helps by giving you more flexibility without adding more geometry. As a final thought for this segment, following constraints can be fun and useful. It might teach you new things and push you to create something that you otherwise wouldn't have. But you don't have to be a purist. Follow the constraints you set for yourself, but only as long as they serve you and your creative process. One example of a PS1 limitation that I chose to neglect was to use per pixel lighting instead of per vertex lighting. The PS1 was only capable of per vertex lighting. You can see it in action in this clip from Silent Hill 1. Notice the sharp angle of the lighting interpolation behind the character. This is the signature look of vertex coloring in low poly models. Contrast this against Silent Hill 2 for the Xbox, which was the first game to use per pixel lighting. I decided to go with the latter option because I valued a little bit more of visual fidelity over a completely purist approach that would rigorously obey the PS1's limitations. Next up, we have programming. While I programmed the game, I don't consider myself a programmer, so for this segment, I will just give you a few tips and things I wish I knew when I started working on the project. Tip number 1 is use scriptable objects. They are so handy. They allow your game systems to be more modular and component-based. They allow you to easily edit the data that is used by those systems, and each component does a single thing, and you can use different components to build something new. To give a practical example, the game's dialogue system takes data that is stored in scriptable objects. For each dialogue sequence, I can determine what happens when the speech begins and ends by triggering game events that are also scriptable objects. I can play sounds, update quest states, play animations, you name it. Most importantly, if I later decide that something needs to be changed, I can easily do it. My tip number 2 is decide early on if you're going to localize your game, because it is a hassle to implement later on. Localization can be a cheap way to boost sales. If like me you have a very small budget, you can get half-decent translations through Fiverr, and then you can get your foreign friends to proofread the translation for you. Just remember to thank them in the credits. It's also useful to have a debug mode in your localization system that cycles through all of your different languages. This way you can easily check if your CJK, meaning Chinese, Japanese, Korean, fonts are all working correctly. Tip number 3 is use procedural geometry to spruce up your UI. It's a really cool and fun thing to learn how to code, and you can then use it to create and procedurally animate UI panels for your game. In NIGHTSLINK, I use Perlin noise to make them wobble, as you can see here. Now on to the game's audio. While I had initially planned to do this part myself, I eventually realized that it wouldn't make sense to do it just for the sake of it being a true solo project. I contacted the sound designer Walter Abreu, who I had already worked with before on a lot of game jams, and who I trusted to do a better job than I ever could. So this is also a tip for whoever is starting out. Go to game jams, meet people from different areas of expertise. Once you find people you work well with, keep them around. When working with them, give them some directions regarding what you're looking for, but let them come up with their own ideas. Don't micromanage them. Give them a description of what you want, but never a prescription of how they should arrive there. I asked Walter to create a video talking about his approach to sound design and music on NIGHTSLINK. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Hey there, I'm Walter Abreu. I'm a composer and sound designer with a great passion for video games and cinema. My interest in music comes from a really young age, around 7 or 8 years old. Back then, my parents bought me a Walkman, and I listened to a lot of recorded cassettes from my brother. While I enjoyed a lot listening to music, the thing where I really spent most of my time with was playing PlayStation and computer games. Later, as a teenager, I sometimes was messing around with game installation files and eventually came across something known as mods, or tracker music files. These are similar to MIDI but made in a sequencer with very specific commands. This allowed me to edit the songs from some of the games I played back then, and it encouraged me to start composing my first tracks as well. Later, I started playing guitar, then started recording some of my stuff, and naturally, as I grew older, I went on to study music production and later sound design. During the years, I've been releasing music under the name Sileni, which is a dark and experimental project where I explore a lot of sampling, synthesis, and other sound design techniques. I've also contributed with music for video and live performances using custom interactive systems. While I love video games and worked on several projects in mostly game jams, for example, NIGHTSLINK is actually the first commercial game which I worked for. I'm currently working on some other games and music projects which I'll hopefully reveal in the future. But let's talk a little bit about NIGHTSLINK. Before I started working on NIGHTSLINK, I made a brief analysis of it. The game has a really dark setting with mysterious and dreamlike moments, and a somewhat disturbing atmosphere to it. Obviously, classic horror games such as Silent Hill or Resident Evil are the first ones to come to mind. But actually, I took more inspiration from other titles from the PlayStation 1 era. In the first level of Nightmare Creatures 2, you wake up in a psychiatric hospital which shares many similarities with the apartment corridors from NIGHTSLINK. I find their atmosphere quite identical, as well as their choice of colors and textures. The drone-based soundtrack composed by Frédéric Mott was definitely one of my main inspirations for this. And then there are some intersections in NIGHTSLINK where you get a glimpse of these deserted streets, which somehow reminded me of an old exclusive PlayStation game called C12 Final Resistance, a post-apocalyptic third-person action game where you play in a city that was mostly destroyed after a massive alien invasion. The dark ambient soundtrack during moments with more exploration served as a good reference for me in sections where I didn't want really deep horror-sounding tracks. There are moments in NIGHTSLINK where you can interact with the tape recorder. This was one of the most cool things to play with in terms of audio, as almost everything is a lot more of a computer or synth work. For these particular scenes, I actually recorded several samples of myself pressing buttons in small machines, picking up real cassettes, amongst other things. I made this while watching a gameplay video of these sections. Most of the sounds in NIGHTSLINK are tuned using B as the root note. From the more musical counterparts to the lamps noise that you can hear in the corridors. In the background, you go from a simple room tone to a drone music track which gets bigger and noisier as you progress in the game. All of this stays in harmony like in a piece of music, where everything belongs to the same place. There are also a lot of recorded sounds, like wood or metallic sounds, doors, windows, etc., which are scattered across time and around the 3D space to keep the player in this state of awareness. All of these things I've mentioned are achievable with your favorite recording tools and software. But my weapon of choice for putting it all together is Fmod Studio. This middleware simplifies the communication between developers and sound designers, saving a lot of time and really making things easier overall. It enables you to create several variations of your sounds, experiment with 2D and 3D events, and test them in real time. So I highly recommend using it. This concludes my presentation. I hope it was worth your time. Thanks for listening and feel free to ask your questions.
In regards to marketing, what I did was follow these steps. First, I created a press kit. This step is fairly easy and there is a ton of information online regarding how to create a good press kit. But don't neglect this part, because this is how journalists are going to learn about your game and get access to screenshots and videos to use in their content. Next step is to create a trailer for your game. This is what's going to get people hyped about your game and what personally got me a lot of attention on social media. Here are some tips about this part. If you are making a 3D game, add a free-fly cam that you can switch to during runtime and record your footage with. And by the way, you're gonna have to get good at recording that footage. Use a controller for smoother camera movement and rotation. It's something you'll have to practice at first, and you're going to have to find the perfect movement and rotation speed values for your footage, but it's also a fun process that I think you'll enjoy. Don't make your trailer longer than it needs to be. If you're making a short game, make the trailer short. If it's a story-driven game, get as close as possible to spoilers without spoiling anything. It also helps to think of your trailer as though it was a micro-movie. If you chart its intensity over time, you should end up with something like this. Without further ado, here's the trailer for NIGHTSLINK. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, next step. Contact press sites about your game. I opted to do this ahead of time, about 3 weeks before the game released, in order to get some reviews for the Steam page. You're going to want to create a big spreadsheet with each site's name and contact info, as well as the review key you are going to send them. If possible, you always want to be talking directly to someone in particular and address them by name. Don't send the same exact email to everyone. You can copy and paste the info related to your game, but at the very least write the introductions, taking into consideration who you're writing for. And don't forget to include the Steam key in the email. Don't expect people to email you back asking for the key, just give it away freely on the first email. Let them know that you're free to answer any questions that might arise. If people write back, take the time to thank them for their interest. And that's pretty much it. If you get good reviews, include them in your Steam store page. You can also get a fair amount of free promotion from Twitter accounts. All you have to do is find accounts that retweet games similar to yours. Contact them, and they will usually be happy to tweet about your game, getting potentially thousands and thousands of people interested in it. Some of these people will also retweet the post, further exposing your game to more and more people. All of this for free. Next step, send keys to hand-picked YouTubers and curators. My approach to this was to contact a limited number of people that focused on the horror niche. That way, I could dedicate more time to one-on-one communication and forming a relationship with each of those curators. If your game is story-driven, you'll likely want to do this after the game is released to avoid spoilers. At the moment, these are the two most watched videos regarding NIGHTSLINK. If your game is short and not very replayable, you might be concerned that the people who watch these videos won't be interested in picking up the game afterwards. My solution for that was to create an alternate reality game around my game. ARGs are a good way to get your players more engrossed in the game's story, encouraging them to explore its secrets and solve challenges that allow them to get access to secret content. It adds value to your game and gives players a reason to think about it and to keep coming back to it. There's an achievement tied to a secret Easter egg in NIGHTSLINK. In order to reward whoever finds it, I have created 5 handmade cassette tapes identical to the ones in the game, one for each of the first 5 people who find the Easter egg. People immediately got interested in this, asking if they have been claimed already and going to the Steam community forums and the game's official Discord server, trying to find ways to unlock that achievement. And so, a bit from all over the world, people started to jump into the discussion and sharing their findings, going to surprising lengths and showing a great amount of investment in the game. In doing so, they were able to uncover secrets that aren't even specifically related to the secret Easter egg, but that add new layers to the game's story and lore. For example, here we have a Japanese player that managed to crack the game's cryptic alphabet. When engaging with your game in this way, players are also encouraged to get engrossed in its story, and also to tell their friends about what's going on, and potentially getting them interested too. If you're looking for a low-budget way to get people more engrossed in your game and talking about it, I would recommend you consider something like this. By the way, all the tapes are unclaimed as of yet, so if that kind of thing interests you, I welcome you to play the game and join our Discord, and I wish you the best of luck in finding that secret Easter egg. Now, about the game's story and design. I'm going to keep this section spoiler-free and let you guys experience the story for yourselves if you're interested in it. However, I do want to give you some pieces of advice regarding this particular style of storytelling. Find out what is going on in your world and think of all the ramifications that might have. When you introduce an element into your world, simulate in your head what the consequences of that element might be. If you create a world where pain does not exist, what would be the ramifications of that? How would that affect the world's technology or its culture? Would a new religion be created around it? Once you know the answers to these questions, you can create a world that is more consistent and immersive, and then you decide which are the aspects you want to present to the player. NIGHTSLINK is intentionally vague, and there's room for interpretation. I say vague in quotation marks because there are numerous story-related details in the game, and those can be used to build your own interpretation of the events. I also believe that people are smart. You don't need to connect the dots for them. Interpretive play is also play. Don't rob your players of that. What I mean by this is that in a game like NIGHTSLINK, most of the meaningful and interesting play that's happening is happening inside the player's imagination. What just happened? What did this sentence mean? What is my character trying to accomplish? What is the story about? Why did the author make this game? In a game like NIGHTSLINK, giving these answers away would be to strip away the experience almost entirely. Don't rob your players of your game's interpretive play. And also, give them time to engage in it. What I ended up doing in NIGHTSLINK is having small sections where the player is just recording the cassette tapes or transporting them from A to B. These sections were included in order to encourage the player's mind to wander and think about the events that are occurring in the story and the information they have been given so far. When you create a story-driven game, you are constructing an interpretive play space, so make sure to give the player some moments of respite to explore it. However, make sure these moments don't last too long, because once the player feels like they have sufficiently explored that space, their attention will be back to the moment-to-moment gameplay, sitting idly waiting for the next interesting thing to take place. Of course, as an author, you are going to have your own interpretation, but you should keep it to yourself. Your interpretation is not more important than anyone else's. However, if you share it publicly, players will take it as canon, and then what else is there to discuss? If your aim is to bring people together in discussion and allow them to share their perspectives with one another, keep your interpretation to yourself. So far, the critical reception has been fairly positive, with 89% positive reviews on Steam. Despite getting a lukewarm reaction here in Portugal, the game got a fair bit of attention overseas. Polygon described the game as a bite-sized experience that has successfully used its short runtime to lodge itself into the back of their brain. The Verge stated that the game's strength lies in its ambiguity and its ability to hint at a story that is more complex than what its half hour of gameplay could possibly hold. There was also, of course, some negative criticism. Some reviewers criticized the game for its short runtime, despite its estimated runtime being stated in the store page description. Others criticized its ambiguity, stating that the game throws out a lot of questions with virtually no resolutions, complaining that the game favored story interpretation over hardline meaning. It seems that the game's ambiguity happens to be both its strength and its weakness, depending on who you ask. You can't please everyone, especially if that person went into the game looking for a completely different experience than one you set out to make. The most you can do is to do your best in managing the player's expectations and to let them know what they are signing up for. Here are some final notes. Making a short game is risky. If you're releasing your short game on Steam, be aware that their 2-hour refund policy will mean that a percentage of your players will refund your game. In NIGHTSLINK's case, this was about 10%. However, making a short game shouldn't be risky. Developers shouldn't be punished for creating short experiences that respect their players' times. I am aware that some people are fighting this trend. Most recently, NerdMonkeys came out with their short games collection to be released on the Switch, so hopefully more people will be creating and playing short games outside of Steam, eventually forcing their hand and making them rethink their refund policy. All in all, I believe that you should create the game that you want to create. If you want to make a short game, make a short game. If you want to make a weird game, make a weird game. As long as you make it good, rest assured, at least some people will be interested in it. Thank you.